Toronto, a modern city teeming with millions. Every day, people travel its streets, unaware that buried beneath them lies over 12,000 years of antiquity, hidden relics that shed light on the distant past. These are the stories of a dedicated group of archaeologists racing to uncover history before it disappears forever. This is Toronto Unearthed.
Here we are on Yonge Street, and we're heading for an excavation that's just behind the red brick building on the other side of the street. It's called the Squire site, and that is the excavation of a mercantile store that dates to the 1850s, the mid-19th century. So one of the more colorful historical establishments along Yonge Street is the Zanzibar. It's hard to believe that there's an 1850s excavation right beside it. Yonge Street's one of the oldest streets in the province. It was actually conceived of by Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe in the late 1700s, in the 1790s. That's because he had traveled up to the Lake Simcoe region, and he was also aware of the carrying place trails that linked Lake Ontario with the upper Great Lakes through the Humber River, the Don River, that took people northward with their goods. So Yonge Street was his vision of linking the burgeoning town of York with the north. And in fact, the construction of Yonge happened in episodes. By 1850, there were establishments, wooden frame buildings, some brick buildings lining the street front, but the road itself was still kind of a muddy, rutted road. So the development of the street itself was a work in progress. The access to the site is actually off a laneway just east of here called O'Keefe Lane. It has lots of character. So here we are, we're at O'Keefe Lane, and the access for the site we're looking for is off this lane. So our crews come down this lane every day and set up and get to see the life of the laneway. So here we are at the site. You can see that the crew is busy already, working with a large Caterpillar machine to strip the soil off to reveal what it is we're looking for. I'd like to introduce you to David Robertson, who's actually ASI's manager of urban archaeology. You've been here about a week, I guess.
Yeah, about that, yeah.
Looks like you've made great progress. What actually have you found?
We've found a number of outbuildings along the back, so they would have faced on the laneway.
Privy?
Yeah, we found a privy. The buildings themselves are a bit later than what we're actually looking for, and it's a series of industrial occupations. So there's a cooper in the 1850s, a cutler in the 1860s, and that's a knife maker, edge tools, that kind of thing. And then the third guy who was here the longest, and that's Thomas Squire.
He's a dye maker.
He was a dyer, yeah. So he
dyer.
dyed.
He actually dyed wool.
Yeah, he dyed silk and wool, and we're thinking for a dyer, there's going to be big vats, but we haven't seen anything yet. But I suspect if we're going to find them, they're going to be on this half.
So on many sites when we're excavating, we find privies. These are kind of the toilets of the day.
They are.
But they're also huge receptacles for the debris of the day. Does it look like these have that kind of...
The one we dug, we've probably got 10,000 artifacts.
Wow.
I would say. That's
Wow.
a guess, but...
Already?
Yeah. We've got some interesting things to
And
show you
is it
today.
mid-century material?
Yeah.
Excellent,
Yeah.
excellent. You're right, this is a much better view. So, what have you found? And I see, am I right? There's a bit of a brick wall right here.
There's a brick wall
Yeah.
coming almost through here, and it turns this way.
Yeah.
We lose it. There's a catch basin there. And that building does not appear on any map that we have.
I love mysteries.
So yeah, we don't really know what it is. Now this half is really the half that most strongly relates to Squire. So this is what we're holding out hope for in terms of this building here in particular.
Dave, let's just take a closer look at these privies. It's hard for people to see, but there's actually two of them here, right?
Yes, there is.
So this wall here maybe that's the original privy, the smaller one, do you think?
Possibly. We're going to have to clean it up to figure out the relationship between them. But you can see they've cut a hole in this one, and anyhow, you can see they've built a box. There's a thin layer of wood. So we'll sort out which is which. Yeah, the artifacts will certainly tell us when they were abandoned.
Yeah, well, the other one you said had 10,000
Yeah.
artifacts. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
That's great, Dave. You'll be bringing back another 20,000.
Well, we'll see. Everyone's different, you know,
Yeah.
in terms of what people put in them.
Well, you know what? I'm going to leave you to explain to folks
Okay.
what you find by the end of the afternoon, because
Okay.
you should have a pretty good understanding
Hopefully
of this building. I'll catch up with you later, maybe in the lab or something. But in the meantime, good hunting.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
So for the rest of the day, we're going to take out the remaining fills in that area, the essentially modern fills. We're going to try to expose that wall, which is very poorly preserved. And then we're going to swing around this way and continue uncovering this building here, which is just barely below the asphalt. So that's going to be a very delicate operation. That's the plan for the rest of the day. We'll see where we get. This is basically the last chance to document this period on this lot. So people say, well, it's 19th century. We know all about the 19th century because it's all written down, but it's really not. The artifacts that we find can tell us things about the people that nobody recorded. So we've got a series of brick walls going in all sorts of different directions here. They've been really messed up by some later disturbance. So we're looking for articulated bricks that form a proper built pattern. I think this is actually a turn, but it's just so messed up that it's hard to tell. I brought a selection of artifacts that we recovered from the privy that we excavated last week. This soda water bottle is the A&W Burns Company, who were at 406 Yonge Street, so they're just up the street. So it's another example of, manufacturing right here. So these guys just went up the street and bought their soda water from another small-scale producer. And these guys were carrying on business under this name from about 1870 to 1877 or 78. So it's a very tight date, which is really useful for us. We're trying to define this feature, which runs around here and through here. It's a very odd shape. It's like a giant bathtub. So maybe this is our dyer's vat. Don't know. So there's something coming off this way too. Yeah. How odd. I think we should switch buckets. It's too tight. You're too tight. I think so, you're too tight. And of course, there's the elegant egg cup, which in fact had the egg shell still in it. So how it got in there is kind of a mystery. You don't usually throw out your egg cup with your egg, unless you have an accident, I guess, with your egg, and you break your cup. So that's kind of odd.
I'm trying to see if there's any wall in here underneath the ash. It's that same plaster. That's the second layer of asphalt. Great.
This is a sauce bottle. It's marketed as Victoria sauce, and we don't know what Victoria sauce is. We can't really find a good description of what it was. It may have been like a Worcestershire sauce, something savory. We're still trying to figure out what exactly it was.
Are there some remnants of the sauce in there you can taste?
No. No, and because these came from a privy, we treat them fairly carefully when they come out of the ground because, there's still potentially contamination from sewage in these features. So even when they're washed, people are wearing gloves. And if there's liquid in them, you don't really want to sample that. Well, we've done all we can today in terms of the excavation. So next week we're going to have a crew come in and deal with all the various features, do all the recording and the excavation. The interesting things we found are this big pit-like feature here, which is lined with wood. We don't know what it is. We've got this very poorly preserved wall, which you can't even recognize as a wall right now because it's so fragile that we've just had to leave it as it is. We've got the two privies that we originally found on this side yesterday, and then we've got this brick structure here, which is incredibly narrow, so we're not exactly sure what that's all about. But hopefully, as we work through next week, we'll answer some of these questions. This is our fourth week on site. We're nearing completion. We've found some very interesting things, some of which we expected, some of which we didn't. So why don't we go through and take a look? Excavating this site has been really helpful in terms of getting a little bit better understanding of Yonge Street 150 years ago, because it was a very different place than today. When we first started working on this site, we didn't know what we'd find exactly. We were hoping to find remains of the industry that took place here in terms of dyeing cloth. We didn't honestly know what that might look like, and we found some things that are intriguing from that perspective. We're just completing the last stages of the work, cleaning up some features and excavating the fills out of them to recover the artifacts, and also to try to figure out what these features are. We're still a little puzzled by some of the things we've found. They're a bit unusual for a normal site, but given that this was a dye works for many years, it's perhaps not to be unexpected that we would find some things that we don't quite understand. When we were last here a couple of weeks ago, we had just uncovered this feature here, and we didn't really know what it was. It seemed to be, we thought it might be a wood-lined tank or something. So we spent a lot of time removing all the soils in it and from around it, and we still don't know what it is. It's not a tank, we can say that much. There seemed to be a floor, which you can see the remnants of here, which extended out here into a big hole, a big rectangular hole, or a cut as we call them. And that was filled with material that, to all intents and purposes, looks like it's privy fill. But again, it's one of those things that we're just going to have to try to figure out as we move on into the analysis stage of the project. We often don't know much about people like the Squires because they left very little written record. We don't have pictures of them. We don't have really anything other than what we find in things like censuses that were taken every 10 years. So we would know where they lived, we would know their occupation, we'd know how many children they had. But beyond those basic facts, we know very little about them. And that's the case for most of the people that lived in Toronto at that time. Drawing and photographing the features is really important because as we're digging them, we're destroying them. There is a maxim that archaeology is destruction. So the only record that will exist of this site after we're gone is what we take away in terms of the paperwork, the drawings, the photographs, the artifacts, and that's what we use to essentially recreate the site virtually. Preservation by record, basically. The artifacts we find will be analyzed in our lab, and our ultimate objective is to get them to some kind of public repository like a museum, and hopefully someday other researchers can look at them. They are quite evocative of the period, so that's our ultimate objective, is always to get them somewhere where the public can have access to them. We're going to take away I'd guess 50,000 artifacts from this site, which is a fair number when you consider the size of the area that we've been working in. That will take months of work in terms of cleaning and analyzing. So as we go from here to the lab and you see the process at that end, maybe we'll have a few more answers or possibly even more questions than we already have. But it's the next stage of the process, and we'll see you there.
We're at ASI headquarters here on Bathurst Street in downtown Toronto. We've been working for months on all of the thousands of artifacts that we recovered from the Squire site. These artifacts are keys to solving some of the mysteries about the site. I think we found some very interesting results. Let me take you in. So, welcome to ASI. ASI actually has been around for 37 years. We were founded in 1980. And we do two kinds of work basically in the field. We do historic archaeology and we do pre-contact indigenous archaeology. We have a GIS center here, Geographic Information Systems, where we analyze spatial data, people working on environmental assessment reports. But where we want to go is our downstairs laboratory, where we're processing the artifacts from the Squire site. So here we are at our lower lab, and with respect to the Squire site, this is where all the action's happening. That the artifacts come in from the field in a van, they're brought in here, and they're washed. As Tessa's washing them, she's splitting them roughly into categories. So whiteware's here, redware's here, and all of this occurs literally for months. Once they're washed, they go onto drying racks, which are just outside, where they sit for a couple of days to fully dry. And we then begin the process of categorizing these artifacts very carefully and bagging them for the final analysis. This material is then taken and we begin the process of analyzing the artifacts and entering it into a database. So imagine tens of thousands of artifacts, each with many attributes that are being recorded in the database, which then collectively provides us with the information that we need to know what was happening on the site. So this isn't the only lab we have an upper lab. And Dave is there right now looking at a few artifacts to finish off a section of the report on the Squire site. Let's go up. Here we are in the upper lab. Hi Dave, what's happening?
Well, we're just wrapping up some of the final questions for the report. Looking at the various features in the yard, and we've managed to identify some of them as specifically related to the dye works.
Oh, that's interesting. In the backyard?
In the backyard, yeah. We had, if you recall, we had a small brick feature that was a really tiny building. It didn't seem to have
we didn't know what
doors.
it was. Yeah.
We did some work looking at 19th century descriptions of dyeing, the dyeing process, and have decided that it's actually the vats where the dyeing took place.
Wow, right in the yard.
Right in the yard. And there, we also found the base of a boiler, which would have heated the water for the dye. That's pretty exciting. We haven't seen that before in Toronto. And
it's a first.
It's the first. Great. I've also been looking at another feature that we thought might be a second vat that was found at the back of the property. Right. We thought it might have been a wooden vat, but we had some analysis of the soils done to look at the insects that were in there. And it turns out that it was probably a compost bin because the beetles that were in there were things like potato beetles.
Did you get dung beetles in the previous
We did,
as well?
we did, yeah.
Okay.
But that's another answer that got solved based on
some analysis.
Specialist analysis.
That's very interesting. I think there's a lot of artifacts on the boardroom table. Maybe we should take a look at those.
There are, yes. Yeah.
Eva McDonald is our manager of historical archaeology. She is the resident expert on this material, and whenever we have a site like this, Eva's the one who tells us what these objects are all about. What do we got here?
Well, we've got a fabulous assortment of domestic material. As we know, the Squire family lived on the same site where they worked, so these are all a great representation of the daily activities that took place on the site. There's one thing really interesting I find by this artifact here. This is an extract bottle, and you would expect to find this on a site because people bought extracts to flavor the things that they were cooking with in the 19th century. But there's more than a dozen of these that were discarded, and that is something that is sort of out of the ordinary for a domestic site.
More than normal.
Yeah, so there's got to be another use for this bottle, and there's no reason why once something was empty, it could have been filled with something else.
Are we actually looking at some of the industrial signature of the site? Because 19th century dyes were they were very complicated recipes, and a lot of different compounds would go into them. And you would think that the Squires would be making their own dyes
rather than purchasing them, they're making them.
So they're going to have
need
lots of chemicals on site that they need to store. And this is a very subtle
It's a subtle
trace of the dyeing.
Yeah, and you don't think of children on industrial sites either, but there's lots of evidence of kids. There's a wonderful little mug here that's got a printed motto on it, like Benjamin Franklin, his sayings, and it's, it's sort of to remind children to behave. The animal bone is really interesting for the diet. Basically, each bone represents a part of the body. So, for example, Ron, there's a jaw there.
Yeah.
That's not something that you necessarily would bring home from the supermarket, would you? The head of an animal.
No.
Something like that suggests that there actually was primary butchering on site.
Just in summary, what does this assemblage tell us about the Squire family?
Well, I think it's brought us a little closer to 19th century life on Yonge Street. It's told us how people mixed their residence with their work. I think the extract bottles are very telling in that regard. And you can see other things in the animal bone because, yes, this was probably butchered off, but it would have been used too. And that's a really cheap dish, head soup. Probably. The Squires went on, they had their large plant in Parkdale, but probably frugal. Their business was growing slowly and they had to be careful. But in the end, they probably were a great success story in terms of Toronto industry.
So we have a lovely archaeological snapshot of life on Yonge in the mid-19th century. Love it.